Hey guys, welcome to the Liberal Hive Mind, a channel solely focused on exposing the abundant hypocrisy of the left. You know what's crazy to me? How Democrats are winning the black vote. What exactly are they doing? Like, what's the messaging campaign? Outside of empty government-funded promises, what exactly is the campaign messaging? I don't know about you guys, but Democrat rhetoric targeting the black community to me seems incredibly vapid, empty. You're a victim, therefore vote for us. And their ahistorical arguments just simply don't hold up to basic scrutiny. It's facts, logic, and history versus empty emotional nonsense that generally isn't saying something or just frankly makes no sense. And boy, do I have the perfect example for you. Intellectual heavyweight presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy took on CNN's morning show panel with Don Lemon and his co-host, I believe it's Poppy Harlow, correct me if I'm wrong, and the contrast between the two was just incredibly glaring. This is going to be a uniquely rare Liberal Hive Mind reaction video. I don't usually make videos like this, but I want to react to this whole thing. We got some stuff to get into, so let's roll the tape. Alright folks, so the article's from Mediaite, and obviously it's a totally left-wing biased publication. They're promoting this video as if Don Lemon smacked down Vivek Ramaswamy. The title writes, "Infuriating, CNN's Don Lemon gets pissed when GOP candidate tries to splain black history to him in epic smackdown." But really, the exact opposite is true. Vivek Ramaswamy mopped the frickin' floor with these two Democrat hack clowns at CNN. Let's just play the clip and I'll interject at certain points.
I want to get into a few issues, one of them being China. Before I get to China, I just want to better understand something you said this week speaking before the audience at the NRA. Here's what you said, referring to back to 1865. Here it was.
I want you to raise your hand if you know when the first anti-gun laws were passed in this country. Raise your hand if you do. 1865. You want to know when it happened? We fought a civil war in this country to give black Americans the equal protection under the law that we failed to secure them in 1776. But then you want to know what happened? Southern states passed anti-gun laws that stopped black people from owning guns. The Democrat Party, then as in now, wanted to put them back in chains.
Then as in now, that's quite an accusation about the current Democratic Party. Who and what were you referring to?
I was referring to Joe Biden and his expression of wanting to put them back in chains, dating back to Lyndon Johnson. I think Lyndon Johnson's so-called Great Society was one of the greatest misnomers in American political history, where even back then in the 1960s, 70% plus of black kids were born into two-parent homes. Today, that number is less than 30% in the opposite direction. The very policies that we implemented in this country in the name of helping black Americans have actually been disastrous for black Americans and all Americans. And I think that that's something that we need to wake up to.
In 1865, you were talking about the black codes, right?
That's right.
Passed, enacted to make it a crime for a black person to carry a gun in the
Exactly.
South. But you're equating that to the current president? You're referring to economic chains? What are you saying?
Well, I was referring to Joe Biden's, I think, ill-chosen expression to say they're the party that wants to put you back into chains. What I'm actually saying is that if you look at the policies of the modern Democratic Party.
You just said that about Democrats.
Absolutely. So what I'm saying is that actually it's policies like that of Lyndon Johnson and Joe Biden that are actually holding black Americans back.
Lyndon Johnson's the war on poverty?
Yes, and in particular, his Great Society, where he actually created incentives in the family, where if you're a family, you could actually get more money by not having the father in the home. Guess what you get? You get what you pay for. And I think it's been really bad for the black community. I think it's really bad for all Americans.
This was almost as bad as that infamous clip with Jordan Peterson on Channel 4, where the British female anchor just kept going, well, so what you're saying is, she's not genuinely trying to understand what he's actually trying to say. She's simply offended that he's calling out the Democrats. This is the current state of CNN and the mainstream media, a bunch of leftist Democrat hacks who just play defense for the Democrat establishment. She's almost purposely misrepresenting or misunderstanding what he's saying. I don't know if it's bias or if it's in bad faith, but she's essentially saying, so what you're saying is that the Democrat Party is basically the party of Jim Crow. I mean, they kind of are, but even outside of that, no, that's not what he's saying. He's referring to a specific quote that Joe Biden made, claiming that Republicans want to put black people back in chains. And he's saying, actually, that was the Democrat Party back in the 1860s, and that the Second Amendment being granted to minority peoples has actually enabled their freedom. He goes on to make reference to Lyndon B. Johnson policies policies that frankly have hurt the black community. I think that's really not up for debate at this point. And she just keeps going on and on. Oh, so what you're saying is that the Democrat Party is basically the KKK? And it's kind of rich seeing these elitist New York Democrats pearl clutching at that kind of comparison in the first place, considering all they've done for the last 7 years straight is compare Republicans, and of course Donald Trump, especially Donald Trump, to Adolf Hitler in the 1940s Germany. But outside of the pearl clutching, I still don't get where her confusion comes from. She's actually not intellectually curious. She's simply offended by what he's saying because he made the comparison. Her very simplistic thought process probably goes, I'm a Democrat and are you comparing me to the bad Democrats in 1865? She's not actually trying to understand the points that he's making, or she does understand them and she's avoiding them. He's making a very valid point. What he's saying is that Joe Biden and Democrats are advocating for more gun reform, in some cases for repealing the Second Amendment as a whole, and he's saying that that's a bad thing. The Second Amendment essentially evens the playing field, including for black Americans. And when we talk about black Americans and their rights, well, the Second Amendment happens to be one of those rights. And he's arguing that it was one of the, if not the most important constitutional right that black Americans were granted in the 1800s that allowed them to even the playing field, being granted the ability to not only bear arms, but form militias, which safeguarded them against tyranny and oppression. In other words, let's put it into layman terms, it's kind of hard to enslave an armed people. He's saying gun control and nanny state policies have hurt the black community, and that's exactly what Democrats are trying to do. It's a very decent comparison, but elitist New York Democrats don't want to hear a word about it, of course. They take it as a personal attack and respond emotionally in this nonsensical, incoherent manner. And speaking of nonsensical and incoherent, boy oh boy, when Don Lemon joined the conversation, Don Lemon enters the room, it gets even worse.
That war was fought for black people to have freedoms in this country.
Yeah.
Actually, that's why the Civil War was fought.
Okay.
And the sad
but that
part
wasn't
about
fought
it,
for black people to have guns. I think.
Actually, you know, funny fact is, black people did not get to enjoy the other freedoms until their Second Amendment rights were secured. And I think that that's one of the lessons that we learned.
Black people still aren't allowed to enjoy the freedoms.
I disagree with you on that, Don. I disagree with you. I think you're doing a disservice to our country by failing to recognize the fact that we have equality before the law.
When you are in black skin and you live in this country, then you can disagree with me. But we're not. You mentioned that we have three different shades
Don,
of
I think we have to be able to
here.
talk about these issues in the open, regardless of the color of our skin. Black Americans today, to say that, compare that to 1865 and 1964,
I think for you to compare it to
absolutely
1865 and
have
1964
equal rights in this
is
country.
actually, I think it's insulting to black people. It's insulting to me as an African American. I don't want to sit here and argue with you because it's infuriating for you to put those things together. It's not right. Your telling of history is wrong. What
part of the history was wrong?
What part of the history was wrong? That the Civil War was fought. You're making people think that the Civil War was fought for black people, only for black people to get guns and for black people to have
The Civil War was fought for
rights.
black people in this country to get freedoms, a noble mission. And I think that after we succeeded, we had to actually secure those freedoms.
To reduce it in a speech at the NRA to say you're making people think, or you're trying to say that black people to get guns, that was the reason that you're there at the NRA. That was the reason for the Civil War.
It is a
that's
fact.
reductive.
It's not
and
reductive,
I think it's
Don.
insulting. There are a whole plethora of reasons for the Civil War.
With due respect, I find your explanation reductive and actually insulting, including to black Americans, to say that black people today, compared to 1964, 1865, haven't made progress in part because of the freedoms we secured. And the Second Amendment was
black
part
people,
of what secured
hang on,
them that
please.
freedom.
I cannot keep a thought if you guys are talking to me in my ear. So hang on 1 second. So to say that black people, say what you said again.
Black people secured their freedoms after the Civil War. It is a historical fact, Don. Just study it. Only after their Second Amendment rights were secured.
They
That's
were
a
not
fact.
secured their freedoms after the Civil War. That is not. You are discounting Reconstruction. You're discounting a whole host of things that happened after the Civil War when it comes to African Americans, including the whole reason that the Civil Rights Movement happened is because black people did not secure their freedoms after the Civil War, and that things turned around. People tried to change the freedoms that were supposed to
And you
happen
know how they
after the
got
Civil
it?
War
They got their
and
Second Amendment
Reconstruction.
rights, and they actually got the NRA played a big role in that. But today, Don, the
NRA did not play a big role
absolutely,
in
they
that.
trained black Americans how to use firearms.
That's a lie. That's not. The NRA did not play a big role in
This is just historical fact.
It's
but Don,
not historical fact.
The part that I
Just
find
because you say it's historical
the
fact,
part that I
it's not
find
historical
insulting is when you say today black Americans don't have those rights after we have
the
gone
fact
through
that I find
civil rights
insulting
revolution
is
in this
that
country.
You are sitting here telling an African American about the rights and what you find insulting about the way I live, the skin I live in every day.
Here's where you and I
know
have
the
a different
freedoms
point
that
of view.
black and white that black people don't have in this country, and that black people do have.
Well, here's where you and I have a different point of view. I think we should be able to express our views regardless of the color of our skin. We should have this debate
I'm not saying you
without
shouldn't
me
express your
regarding
views,
you as a
but I think
black
it's
man,
insulting that
but
you're
me
sitting
regarding you
here,
as a fellow citizen.
that you're
That's what I
sitting
think we should
here,
say.
whatever ethnicity you are, explaining to me
Whatever ethnicity I am,
about
I'll
what
tell
it's
you.
like to be black in
Whatever
America.
ethnicity I am, I'll tell you.
Now, Don Lemon never actually made an argument. Again, can we actually tackle the merit, the actual content and context of what the discussion is about, of what Vivek is mentioning? No, of course not. Never. Democrats never do that, and that's, of course, why I believe Democrats should not be winning on this issue. They simply get emotional, and Don Lemon is just saying, well, I am of a certain color, therefore. Yeah, that's not an argument. It's the same kind of tactics you see when it comes to discussing women's issues. Well, you're not a woman, therefore you don't have an opinion. Yeah, well, I'm a human being with a functioning brain, the ability to think critically and apply common sense and basic logic. Therefore, I should be allowed to at least enter the discussion and chime in and, hey, maybe I might have a good idea or two. No, of course not. Vivek is not allowed to have an opinion because the pigmentation of his skin isn't dark enough. It's completely ridiculous, and it's not like Vivek is a straight white male, the typical Republican boogeyman, but Don Lemon just gets his panties in a bunch, clutches his pearls, tries to shut down the conversation. You're not allowed to tell me that my Democrat victim narrative isn't legitimate. You're not allowed to tell me or lecture me on American history because you don't check the right identity checkboxes. It's patently absurd, and Vivek is 100% correct in his assessment. The Second Amendment was a catalyst. The right to bear arms is simply the great equalizer. I mean, when you think about the safety of women, for instance, biologically, fundamentally, factually, women are vulnerable. In most cases, they simply cannot defend themselves against a male perpetrator. Well, if the woman is armed and trained on how to use a firearm, all of a sudden it's kind of an even playing field. That's more of a micro example, but it's the same thing on a macro level. You know, certain communities don't necessarily have the same cultural influence, the same political influence and economic influence as other groups. Well, the great equalizer, getting in the way of the future possible oppression of said people, the ability to arm themselves and form well-regulated militias. And it's not just race and identity groups, it's class as well. Different class groups. I mean, let's look at India, for instance. India runs based on a class system. It's called a caste system. The economy is essentially built on modern-day slavery. People who are considered lower class, they're treated terribly, they're paid nearly nothing, they're essentially worked to death in the sun. Well, a system like that can literally only exist if you keep those people vulnerable, weak, and unarmed. It's just simply hard to oppress a group of people who are organized and have the same access to the means of power and defense as everybody else, including the government. You know, leftoids watched that interview with Vivek Ramaswamy and thought, oh, Don Lemon ruined him, he wrecked him. But Don Lemon literally said nothing. He just pandered, he played the victim. Vivek Ramaswamy is an intellectual heavyweight. Don Lemon is an overly emotional 7-year-old. And it just baffles me that anybody can watch that and come to a different conclusion. He was 100% right, and more people should be exposed to real history and just the basic facts. There's a reason why Democrats want to avoid these issues or want to keep people uneducated on the basic facts in history, because if people really learned, if people really knew what was going on and were keyed into the Democrat con, well, they'd be in big political trouble now, wouldn't they? That's what I got for you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and possibly subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, folks, and I'll see you on the next one.